In the dim corridors of American history, few agencies have cast as long and enigmatic a shadow as the Central Intelligence Agency. Yet the origins of this institution, now synonymous with covert action and espionage, are rooted not in secrecy for its own sake, but in the urgent lessons of war and the shifting tides of global power. To understand how the Central Intelligence Agency came to be, one must look back to a world at war and to the United States as it grappled with the consequences of intelligence failure and the need for a new approach to national security. Before the United States entered World War II, its intelligence efforts were fragmented and scattered among various military and diplomatic offices. This lack of coordination left the nation vulnerable, as the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor so painfully demonstrated. In the wake of that disaster, President Franklin Roosevelt recognized the need for a centralized body to coordinate the gathering and analysis of intelligence as well as the conduct of covert operations. Thus, in 1942, the Office of Strategic Services, known as the OSS, was born. The OSS holds a unique place as the first centralized civilian intelligence agency in American history. Led by William J. Donovan, the OSS was tasked with a sweeping mandate: espionage, propaganda, subversion, and post-war planning. It brought together research, analysis, covert operations, counterintelligence, and technical development in a single organization. This was a radical experiment, blending civilian and military expertise to wage a war not just of armies, but of information and influence. The OSS grew rapidly, employing over 13,000 people by the end of the war, and operated behind enemy lines in Europe and Asia, gathering crucial intelligence and carrying out sabotage missions. But the OSS was intended as a temporary wartime measure. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the agency was dissolved, its functions scattered among successor organizations. Some of its personnel and activities were absorbed by the Strategic Services Unit and then the Central Intelligence Group, each serving as a bridge between the OSS and whatever peacetime intelligence structure would follow. This period was marked by uncertainty and debate. The future of American intelligence was anything but settled. What followed was a contentious process shaped by legal, political, and strategic considerations. Debates raged over whether intelligence should remain under civilian or military control, how much transparency should be required, and what safeguards were needed to protect civil liberties. President Harry Truman, keenly aware of the changing world order and the emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union, championed the reform of the nation's intelligence apparatus. The dawning Cold War and the specter of Soviet expansion underscored the need for a unified, robust intelligence capability. The solution arrived in the form of the National Security Act of 1947. This sweeping legislation reorganized American foreign policy and military structures, creating not only the Central Intelligence Agency, but also the National Security Council and the Department of Defense. The Central Intelligence Agency was established as the primary civilian intelligence agency, its lineage tracing directly back through the Office of the Coordinator of Information, the OSS, the Strategic Services Unit, and the Central Intelligence Group. On September 18, 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency formally came into existence. From its inception, the Central Intelligence Agency was charged with two main functions: gathering foreign intelligence and conducting covert operations abroad. It was designed as a civilian agency, distinct from the military, and reporting ultimately to the president. The creation of the CIA required political and legal finesse, with careful consideration given to the protection of civil liberties even as the agency was empowered to operate in the shadows. The concept of covert action operations undertaken to influence events abroad without direct attribution became central to the CIA's identity. While the agency's early years would see evolving interpretations of its mandate, the foundation laid by its wartime predecessors and by the architects of the National Security Act was clear. The United States, facing a new era of global challenges, would no longer leave its intelligence efforts to chance or to scattered bureaucracies. Instead, it would meet the world's uncertainties from a new center, a covert center designed to safeguard the nation's interests by whatever means necessity required. To truly understand the CIA's unique role in American power, one must first grasp the concept of covert action. Those secret maneuvers hidden from public view through which the United States seeks to shape events abroad. Covert action is not simply intelligence gathering, nor is it straightforward diplomacy or open military engagement. Instead, it occupies the shadowy space in between, defined by its intent to influence political, economic, or military conditions in other countries without public acknowledgement of American involvement. At its core is plausible deniability, which allows the United States government to deny responsibility if operations are exposed, thereby managing the risks of political fallout or diplomatic crisis. The legal foundation for these actions was carefully laid in the late 1940s. In December 1947, as Cold War anxieties mounted, the National Security Council issued Directive 4A, authorizing the CIA to conduct psychological warfare. This authority was quickly expanded by NSC-2 in June 1948, which broadened the CIA's mandate to include not only propaganda, but also economic warfare, sabotage, subversion, and support for anti-communist elements. These directives firmly established the CIA's authority to conduct covert operations, all while emphasizing the necessity of plausible deniability. The goal was to allow the United States to intervene abroad without leaving clear fingerprints that could be traced back to Washington. Covert action can take many forms, each tailored to the circumstances and objectives at hand. Propaganda is perhaps the most subtle, involving the dissemination of information, true, misleading, or outright false, to shape perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors in foreign populations. Political action, another key tool, might involve backing certain political parties or leaders, swaying elections, or supporting groups opposed to hostile regimes. Economic operations can include hidden efforts to disrupt an adversary's economy through sabotage, manipulation, or denial of critical resources. Paramilitary activities represent the most direct form of covert action, involving the training, arming, or deployment of irregular forces to carry out sabotage, insurgency, or even targeted violence, all designed to achieve United States objectives without the overt use of American troops. Within the CIA, the Special Activities Center serves as the hub for these shadowy undertakings. Staffed by individuals often drawn from elite military units, this center is charged with planning and executing paramilitary and political operations, always maintaining the essential cloak of deniability. The work is highly secretive and often coordinated with other branches of government, including, at times, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to ensure that covert activities align with broader national security goals. Yet the very secrecy that enables covert action also raises profound questions of law and ethics. Under United States law, covert action may proceed only with a presidential finding, a formal determination that the operation is necessary to support national security interests. This requirement is meant to ensure that the president personally authorizes such risky ventures and that Congress is kept informed, at least at the leadership level, through reporting mandates. In theory, these checks are designed to prevent abuses and ensure accountability for actions taken in the nation's name. In practice, however, the line between legal authorization and unchecked power has sometimes blurred, especially when secrecy shields controversial programs from public or even congressional scrutiny. Ethical concerns loom large over covert operations. By their very nature, these actions may involve deception, manipulation, and violence, challenging fundamental notions of transparency and democratic oversight. Scholars and policymakers have long debated where to draw the line, how much secrecy is justified, and at what cost to the ideals the United States claims to uphold. Cases like the infamous MKUltra program or the failed Bay of Pigs invasion have brought these issues into sharp relief, sparking calls for stronger ethical norms and more robust oversight. The tension between national security imperatives and ethical boundaries remains unresolved, a persistent challenge for those who wield the tools of covert action. International law, too, occupies an ambiguous role. While arguments about the legality of covert activities under global norms are rarely raised in practice, the secrecy surrounding these operations complicates questions of accountability and legitimacy. The United States has, at times, justified covert action as a cost-effective way to pursue foreign policy objectives without the risks or consequences of open conflict. Yet the very effectiveness of such measures depends on their secrecy. Once exposed, the political and diplomatic costs can be severe. In the end, covert action occupies a delicate space in American strategy, supplementing both war and diplomacy at the margins of conflict. It is a set of tools designed to shift patterns of trust, allegiance, and power, all while maintaining the illusion that the United States is not directly involved. The balance between necessity, legality, and ethics is precarious and ever-shifting, making covert action both a powerful instrument and a source of enduring controversy within the American system. In the tense decades of the Cold War, as shadowy lines divided East and West, the Central Intelligence Agency's covert action arm became one of Washington's most potent and controversial tools for shaping world events from behind the curtain. The agency's operatives rarely appeared in the headlines, but their fingerprints can be found on decisive moments in the histories of nations like Iran, Guatemala, and Cuba, moments that changed the course of those countries and, in many ways, the world. The logic was straightforward, at least to its architects. If the United States could not openly confront the spread of communism or protect its interests through diplomacy, it would do so in secret. Covert action promised influence without exposure, victory without the risks of war. Yet, as the decades unfolded, the reality proved far more complicated. One of the earliest and most consequential tests of these secret powers took place in Iran in 1953. At the time, Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had nationalized the country's oil industry, threatening the interests of Western oil companies and, in the eyes of American policymakers, increasing the risk of Soviet influence in a strategically vital region. Declassified documents confirm that the Central Intelligence Agency, working with British intelligence, orchestrated a covert operation known as Operation Ajax that resulted in Mossadegh's removal from power. The operation used a blend of tactics, mobilizing street protests, bribing officials, and spreading propaganda to undermine Mossadegh's legitimacy. The outcome was a swift coup that restored the Shah to power and established a pro-Western regime. Although hailed as a success at the time, the operation left deep scars. The resentment it fostered simmered for decades, ultimately fueling anti-American sentiment and contributing to the rupture of United States-Iranian relations in 1979. Scholars now see the coup as a pivotal moment that continues to haunt both nations. The following year, the Central Intelligence Agency turned its attention to Central America. In 1954, Guatemala became the stage for Operation PB, SUCCCSS, another high-stakes covert intervention. The government of Jacobo Arbenz, elected on a platform of reform, had alarmed United States officials with land policies seen as threatening to American business interests, particularly those of the United Fruit Company. There was also a pervasive fear that Guatemala might fall under communist sway, a prospect Washington found unacceptable. The Central Intelligence Agency responded by engineering a coup using a familiar playbook, psychological warfare, propaganda, and the orchestration of armed opposition. Declassified records revealed the agency even planned assassinations as part of its strategy. The coup succeeded in toppling Arbenz, but the aftermath was tragic. Guatemala descended into decades of instability and violence, marked by authoritarian rule and civil strife. The operation's short-term success did little to alleviate long-term suffering or secure democratic ideals, and it remains a stark example of the unintended consequences that can follow covert action. Cuba, too, became a proving ground for Central Intelligence Agency covert operations, though with a very different outcome. In 1961, the agency organized and trained a force of Cuban exiles for an audacious amphibious assault, the Bay of Pigs invasion, intended to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government. Many of the same officers who had overseen the coup in Guatemala were involved, drawing on their previous experience. The operation, however, was plagued by faulty assumptions and poor planning. The exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs expecting to spark an uprising against Castro, but instead met fierce resistance. The plan unraveled within days, ending in a humiliating defeat. Internal reports and later analysis revealed deep organizational flaws and a failure to appreciate the complexities of covert paramilitary action. The disaster embarrassed the Central Intelligence Agency and the Kennedy administration, leading to a period of intense introspection within the agency and a reassessment of its approach to covert action. In the wake of failure, the United States launched Operation Mongoose, an aggressive campaign of sabotage and subversion against Castro's regime, but the Bay of Pigs had already exposed the perils of relying too heavily on secrecy and deniability. These operations, successful or not, were only a few among many. Between 1947 and 1989, the United States attempted approximately 64 covert regime change operations, with less than 40% achieving their objectives. The pattern that emerges is one of mixed results. Tactical victories sometimes gave way to strategic setbacks, and interventions intended to safeguard democracy or stability often undermined both. The legacy of these actions is complex, marked by both operational ingenuity and moral ambiguity. Time and again, covert action offered the illusion of control, only for history to reveal the limits of secrecy and the profound, sometimes tragic, consequences of manipulating the destinies of other nations from the shadows. The debates sparked by these Cold War operations about effectiveness, ethics, and the true meaning of security continue to shape the public's understanding of what the Central Intelligence Agency is and what it should be. The end of the Cold War brought a profound reckoning for the Central Intelligence Agency and its legacy of covert action. The world had changed. The binary struggle against communism that once justified secret interventions gave way to an unpredictable array of new threats: transnational terrorism, rogue states, and cyber warfare among them. Yet the shadow of decades of clandestine operations lingered, prompting American society and its leaders to question what had been done in the name of national security and at what cost. This reckoning was not just philosophical. In the 1970s and 1980s, a series of revelations shook public confidence in the Central Intelligence Agency. Revelations in the 1970s, such as those uncovered by the Church Committee, exposed illegal activities including assassination plots, domestic surveillance, and unauthorized drug testing from the 1950s through the 1970s. These disclosures fueled widespread calls for reform, leading to the establishment of permanent congressional intelligence committees and new oversight mechanisms. The release of the so-called Family Jewels report in 2007, which cataloged these earlier illegal activities, renewed public scrutiny of the agency's darker chapters but did not directly prompt new legislative reforms. Congress, once content to let the intelligence community operate in the shadows, began to demand answers. The Iran-Contra affair, in particular, exposed loopholes in oversight covert actions that had been hidden not just from the public, but from lawmakers themselves. In response, the Intelligence Authorization Act of 1991 established a clearer legal definition of covert action, addressed the vulnerabilities revealed by Iran-Contra, and imposed new requirements for congressional notification. The ban on assassination as a tool of foreign policy originated with President Gerald Ford's Executive Order 11,905 in 1976 and was reaffirmed by subsequent executive orders rather than being introduced by the 1991 Act. Not everyone welcomed this wave of reform. After the Soviet Union's collapse, some questioned whether the Central Intelligence Agency should be dramatically restructured or even dismantled altogether. Debates arose over the agency's continued relevance in a world where the old enemy had vanished. Critics argued that the Central Intelligence Agency's organizational culture and methods were relics of a bygone era, unsuited to the diffuse and ambiguous threats of the modern age. Yet, despite these criticisms, the consensus that emerged favored reform over abolition. The Central Intelligence Agency would remain the nation's lead instrument for covert action, but with new safeguards and clearer lines of accountability. One of the most significant changes was the expansion of congressional oversight. Previously, the president and a handful of trusted advisors could order covert operations with minimal scrutiny. Now, Congress asserted itself as a check on executive power. Research indicates that elite political opposition, especially from Congress, became a meaningful constraint on the president's ability to initiate covert action, particularly after the reforms of 1975 and the 1990s. By narrowing the information gap between the intelligence community and elected officials, these reforms made it more difficult for secret operations to escape notice or evade accountability. Although covert action remained a small part of the intelligence budget, its heightened visibility and the potential for controversy ensured that every operation would be carefully weighed, debated, and, in many cases, curtailed. The Central Intelligence Agency itself adapted, if sometimes reluctantly. Evidence suggests that the agency has shown greater willingness to declassify information about past covert actions, seeking to foster a measure of public accountability. The inclusion of covert action case studies in the Foreign Relations of the United States series, for example, signals a recognition that secrecy cannot be absolute, not in a democracy that demands answers. Nevertheless, the challenges of covert missions in the post-Cold War era have not diminished. If anything, they have grown more acute. Leaders now grapple with a complex web of practical, ethical, and strategic trade-offs. The failed attempts to remove Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, for instance, illustrated the enduring difficulties of clandestine intervention, flawed planning, unreliable partners, and the unpredictability of foreign landscapes all combined to thwart American objectives. Despite reforms and new constraints, the essential dilemma remains. Covert action is an instrument of policy that promises flexibility and deniability, but it is also fraught with risk and unintended consequences. In the years since the Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency has sometimes repeated old mistakes with mixed or even counterproductive results. At the same time, preserving the agency's ability to act secretly while coordinating more closely with other branches of government is seen by many as a prudent path forward. The story of covert action in the modern era is thus one of reckoning and reform, a continuing struggle to balance secrecy with oversight, power with accountability, and the imperatives of security with the values of an open society. The story of CIA covert action, when viewed through the lens of history, is one of paradox and enduring controversy. After decades of secret operations, Americans and the world at large have been left to grapple with a legacy as complex as it is consequential. The true impact of these interventions, conceived in the shadows, justified by national security, and often shielded from public view, extends far beyond the immediate outcomes of any single operation. Their influence radiates through international relations, the norms of statecraft, and the very fabric of American democracy. One of the most persistent lessons is that covert action, by its nature, involves trade-offs that are rarely straightforward. Leaders who authorize these operations must weigh the potential for short-term strategic gains against the risk of long-term repercussions, sometimes unintended, sometimes unforeseen. There is a constant tension between the perceived necessity of secrecy and the values of transparency and accountability that underpin democratic systems. The United States, perhaps more than any other nation, has developed oversight mechanisms in response to these dilemmas. Offices dedicated to civil liberties, privacy, and transparency now scrutinize intelligence activities, reflecting an evolving commitment to public trust. Yet, even with these safeguards, debates about the legitimacy and limits of covert action remain unresolved. Internationally, the CIA's record has shaped not only United States foreign policy, but also global expectations about the use of clandestine force. States around the world have come to see covert action as a necessary, if regrettable, component of modern power politics, a necessary evil that persists despite international legal frameworks meant to restrain such behavior. While the United States avoids some of the more extreme measures employed by adversaries, the very practice of covert action has contributed to shifting international norms. Legal arguments against covert activities are seldom raised in international forums, but questions of secrecy and legality continue to surface, especially when operations are exposed or cause unintended harm. The long shadow of certain covert actions, such as those in the Middle East, attests to their lasting influence. The 1953 coup in Iran, for example, continues to reverberate through United States-Iranian relations, illustrating how even successful interventions can generate decades of mistrust and retaliation. Scholars examining the aftermath of such episodes note that unintended consequences, regional instability, anti-American sentiment, and the erosion of diplomatic channels often outweigh the original objectives. This pattern is not unique. Case studies from across the globe reveal that covert action frequently fails to achieve its aims and, more troublingly, can undermine the very ideals it claims to defend. Public scrutiny of covert operations reached new heights with the Church Committee's hearings in the 1970s. These proceedings marked a turning point in the relationship between secrecy and democratic accountability. For the first time, Americans were able to examine primary sources and declassified documents that shed light on the inner workings of the intelligence community. These revelations sparked a broader public debate about the role of secrecy in a free society, leading to reforms that enhance congressional oversight and transparency. Nevertheless, the core challenge remains: how to reconcile the need for clandestine action in a dangerous world with the imperative to uphold the rule of law and democratic norms. The historical record also shows that covert operations fail more often than they succeed, and that their negative repercussions can be profound and long-lasting. This recognition has prompted ongoing policy debates within the United States about when, how, and whether to employ such measures. Evidence suggests that while the United States must be prepared to counter adversaries' covert actions and assist allies, it is also compelled to avoid techniques that contradict its stated values. Leaders must navigate these dilemmas, fully aware that the legitimacy of American power depends not only on effectiveness, but also on adherence to principles. As listeners consider the legacy of CIA covert action, they are invited to reflect on the delicate balance between security and liberty, secrecy and openness, necessity and restraint. The story is not one of simple answers, but of enduring questions, questions that continue to shape the nation's foreign policy and its standing in the world. In the end, the impact of covert action is measured not only by the events it shaped, but by the lessons it leaves for the future, the vigilance required to preserve democracy, the humility to acknowledge error, and the constant negotiation between the demands of security and the values that define a free society.